Hello and welcome to Rise with Ice Miller. My name is Michael Ott. I'm an of counsel in our Chicago office and a member of the firm's bankruptcy practice group. Thank you all for coming today. We are really happy to be joined by two professionals in the distressed investment and restructuring space who we think will have a very lively conversation today. First, from Wintrust Bank, we have Bryn Perna.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, and then from MorrisAnderson, we have Dan Dooley. I will throw it to them to kind of give you some of their background and some of their experiences, and we'll start with you, Bryn.
Good morning, everybody. Bryn Perna. I'm from Wintrust Bank. We are the second largest bank in the Chicagoland area. We have about $53 billion in assets. I joined Wintrust in August of 2020, and I'm in charge of the C&I Managed Asset division, which is the division that handles distressed loans. I've been here since August 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. It was a great decision for me. I'm really happy, and I couldn't be more happy to be here with you guys this morning.
Great, thank you. We also have Dan Dooley from MorrisAnderson. Dan, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Certainly. Dan Dooley, MorrisAnderson. I run a small boutique consulting firm in Chicago. We do financial advisory work and restructuring, mostly company side work, mostly out of court, probably 80% out of court, 20% bankruptcy and receiverships, financial advisory and our management, sale of companies in distress. And right now we're pretty heavy in the franchise industry. We've got 8 deals that are active.
Great. Of course, we're here today to discuss financial distress in the franchise industry. And Dan and Bryn are perfectly positioned to have that conversation with us. Before we get started, though, I think we start each of these podcasts with a poll. The poll is, what do you drink in the morning? Coffee, tea, or other? The poll should pop up soon, and you'll have a chance to submit what you do. Also, please stay to the end. We will be giving out a gift certificate to Corner Bakery, which seemed appropriate given the circumstances and the topics of discussion here. To those who, to some lucky winner who stays till the end of the show. And with that, I'll get it started. So we are probably in one of the most unusual business environments in recent history, what with lingering inflation, rising interest rates, and historically low, perhaps even stubbornly low unemployment. And really a changing employment market as it is. What industries do you two believe are the hardest hit by this kind of unique combination of factors?
Bryn, you want to start?
Sure. We're seeing obviously a lot of stress in the automotive sector. They've been hit hard. Anything consumer demand related. They've been, they need to pass through price increases, but at the same time, try and keep their sales levels stable, which has been a challenge for many companies. And then obviously the restaurant industry has been one of the ones more greatly affected by the circumstances of the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say in our case, I would echo pretty much the same thing. The restaurant industry is incredibly busy, especially the QSR and to some degree the casual sector. Anyone that's bringing product in from offshore, primarily the Far East, China, Vietnam, etc., the supply chain has been really, really screwed up. Although it's stabilizing now. So if you're dependent on products coming offshore, that's been a mess for you. And then I would also say construction, because we've got probably 3 companies in the construction industry. We're kind of in a strange situation where we're not sure whether they're heading into a recession or not. So people that build things, commercial buildings, residential buildings, they're not sure whether or not they're going backwards or going forward or staying, and that uncertainty has created very much caution in construction. So those are the 3 areas we see.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn to the franchise industry specifically. How have the current economic factors, the current economic environment, how is that affecting franchise businesses? Dan, why don't you start this one?
Sure. Okay, Michael. Well, it's been a difficult environment because in any business, when you have cost inflation, we've had a lot of cost inflation in the last 18 months, prices always lag, price adjustment always lags that. And the closer you get to the consumer, the harder it is to adjust prices without having an immediate adverse impact on volume. So I think most restaurants are, I'm talking again, QSR casual, not fine dining. So I went out last night and paid $100 for a steak and the place was packed. So that's not adversely affected very much, but they're having a hard time. They've had a hard time quickly adjusting prices to the new normal, if you will. And I think that'll be adjusted probably by the latter part of this year, late 2023, because people put forward 2, 3, 4 price increases. They probably got one or more to put forward. The thing that's weird though, if you think about it, and I'm going to use QSR as an example. I don't eat at fast food places very often, but if you go out now and you buy like a burger, fries, and soda, I mean the price is like $12, and even to relatively affluent people like us, it's kind of like, holy moly, why is it so much? Because in my mind, that's like an $8 meal. And that just shows you the price have gone up by 30-40% in the last couple of years. And if you're at QSR is heavily dependent, I would say, on the lower end of the economic scale. And one, that shock takes a while to get used to the new normal. And secondarily, there's an affordability issue, at least at the lower end. And that's really impacting a lot of restaurants. So the notion of in retail, whether it's restaurants or just regular clothing retail or whatever, people talk about same store sales. I would tell you same store sales are kind of an odd statistic this year and last year, because when your prices go up by 20 or 30% and your sales may go up a little bit, well, your body count, your customers have gone down, your transactions have gone down. So even though it looks like some of these stores are doing okay, we're up 5%, well, yeah, 15% of that's pricing. You lost 10% of your body count. And that is a real disturbing factor. So it's a very different environment. People are trying to adapt to it, and folks are running out of capital because they didn't have enough capital in reserve.
Yeah, they just came out. They just came out of the pandemic. So why PPP and ERTC and the Main Street loan kind of did a bailout, that just kept people's doors open. There isn't a surplus from that. It didn't create any kind of capital. So you've had all these restaurants. One, they don't have the cash. They haven't had the cash to do a CapEx refresh, which, as we know, in some generations, it's about the experience, not just about, a drive-through. And then you also have the labor issues. I have some of the franchisees that I'm talking to. They've had 100% turnover these last 3 years. So everyone from their general manager to their fry cook has left, and they've had to bring in people overtime to train the new people. And that's been a constant problem. It has not gone away. So for the last 3 years, it's been an uphill battle for them to train and retain people. So it's caused their labor costs to skyrocket. Mm-hmm. Obviously, their bank loans are more expensive because of the interest rates. Their supplies are more expensive. And there's a limit to how much the market is going to accept in price increases. So they've really had to, tighten their belt and figure out creative ways to solve the problem. I don't know if you guys saw, but there's a great article on LinkedIn the other day that it actually was showing models of what they think the new stores are going to look like. Did you see that, Dan? And
No, I didn't.
Actually showed an automatic burger flipper. They showed, it's all about automation. It's all about, 3 or 4 drive-through lanes, a much smaller footprint for dine-in. So these are creative people. I mean, I think they're going to survive. I just think what their model looks like 2 years from now is going to be significantly different than the drive-throughs that we're used to today.
Well, that's a real interesting point, Bryn, because in the 2 categories that we operate more in, QSR and casual, historically about 2/3 of the QSR volume goes through drive-through or takeout. People don't sit down in the restaurants. And if you think about when those restaurants are busy, when the dining rooms are really active, it's typically maybe for an hour in the morning, an hour and a half at lunch, and an hour and a half at dinner. So you're active maybe 4 hours out of probably 18 hours of being open, 16 hours of being open. It's a horrible utilization of space. It's 20-25%. And it also is very labor intensive. If you go into, let's say, QSR, and you go up to the counter, there's usually 2 or 3 people there. On the drive-through, there's one person that's just taking money, just bang, bang. It's a efficient type operation. Where I'm going with that is that in many cases, not downtowns, but in suburbs or small towns, QSRs probably should just be kiosk operations with no damn dining room at all. And that does a lot of things. One, it saves a lot of labor. 2, the labor that you have pretty much is stuck in place. They're not moving around. There's no walking around at all. So the efficiency goes through the roof. And 3, your footprint is a lot smaller real estate footprint. You don't need parking, et cetera. So you're going to see QSRs that come out just as kiosks. On the other side, the casual restaurants are all going, damn, we used to only do 5% or so for takeout or delivery. Now with all the delivery services, people coming in, we're probably up to 15%. Maybe we should put a drive-through window in our store. And so you're going to see, casual restaurants with drive-through. So the whole dynamics have changed quite a bit, but the labor situation is probably the most interesting. And I'm not talking about labor cost. I mean, back in the good old days of 2019, we had a huge debate in this country about minimum wage, about $15 an hour, right? And I would tell you, there's not many areas in the country right now that aren't paying $15 an hour for people working at QSR. In many cases, $18, $20 an hour. It's not because they're labor-friendly people. It's because they want to stay open and they have to compete. So it's a pure economic thing. So the labor issue of $15 an hour to some degree is moot across the country. But the bigger issue is just getting people. Somehow the Great Recession changed people's attitudes towards work. And even at the lower end wage scale, and I don't quite understand it. Did all these people move back in with mom and dad and don't need to work? I understand if you're 55 and making a good deal of money, you decide, I'm going to do something else. I don't need money that much. But I don't understand when you're 25 or 30 and you're only making $20,000 or $30,000 a year, how you can get by without working when unemployment's ended. I don't get it. So something really fundamentally is either changed there, or this is one of those things we'll all say, oh, that's obvious. Probably in 10 years, we'll understand what the hell happened. But I don't get it right now.
Yeah, I think the kind of the in-person labor premium seems to have come into play in the last several years. You just have to pay a lot more for workers that have to be there in front of people. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to have something as like a remote lifeguard.
Right. Or even going to court. I mean, you can do a little bit of Zoom, but you need people to be able to go in. I mean, how are you going to try a case in front of a judge if you're working from home?
Well, and you're right, for a fast food or other business like that where you need to be in there actually flipping burgers. I mean, it's a lot more difficult.
I do think the work from home thing is a transitory thing. I think that'll, and I don't mean we're going to go back to everyone having to be in the office 5 days a week. I think it'll probably be more like 4 days a week, more like the New York thing. But I think once the unemployment rate goes up to 5% or so, and I know it's not anywhere near that, it's under 4, 3.5, 3.6, whatever. I think you'll see employers say, we want people in the office. And oddly enough, the whole work from home thing, at least from a professional point of view, it really is damaging to the people who want to be at home most, the younger people, because they're at a point in their career where they have to develop networks, they have to get mentored, they have to observe. And there's a personal touch to that doesn't occur over Zoom and phone calls. And so I understand that it's nice to work in your underwear and, get up when you want and go do all your, I got that. But it's terrible for your career in my animal. And it's also terrible for companies. You can't build any sense of community, any sense of loyalty if everyone is an independent free agent. Hell, it'll be like professional sports. Every 2 years, everyone changes teams. So who plays for your team? I don't know. I got to look. I'm not sure who the hell we traded,
Well, and that leads to the question of, you mentioned that you think this is transitory. What is transitory here, and what do you think it represents a new normal that, makes sense to plan around going forward?
I think the labor situation is transitory. I don't think that's the way the labor market's going to be forever. I think that.
I think Dan.
I think we lost you. Sorry, we lost you there for a second, Dan. If you could just start again.
Okay, sorry. I think the thing that's labor is transitory. I don't think we're going to be facing can't hire people. That's already eased quite a bit. It's not gone away, but it's significantly better. I think that the franchise world is going to go through a shakeout, and with people that don't have much capital and that are struggling and haven't reduced capacity, get rid of stores that are losing money, and have no money to reinvest in the stores. They're going to lose their stores. They're going to lose their businesses, and they're going to be sold or liquidated, one of the two. I think that's temporary. I think there is new pricing. I think everything is going to cost more, and it'll take consumers a year, 2 years, 3 years to kind of expect that. And I also think you're going to see there's going to be a huge emphasis on remodeling stores. I mean, historically, stores need to be remodeled, depending on the franchise, every 7 to 10 years. And we've kind of gone through about 3 years where almost no one's remodeled hardly anything. So I think the other side to that is you're going to see a boom in remodeling stores probably starting next year. So I don't know, Bryn, what you think. Those are what I think is transitory and permanent.
I think the labor force issue is going to be transitory. I agree with you. I think that there's going to be more pressure from all institutions to get people back to the office. I think the office will look different. I think people's schedules will still look different, but I definitely think that is transitory. But during these growing pains, we have a lot of franchisors who have captured this late night model, which is critical to their business. I mean, they do seem to get, some really good pockets. They do seem to get a lot of their revenue on the third shift. The problem is, if you're casual dining and you're relying on tips, the price point isn't such that you're really making, it's hard to say to a waitress, well, hey, we want you to work from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and your price point is $6-7 a meal. You're not going to get a giant tip from that. And the wage market is still such that, the waitresses work for a certain amount per hour plus tips. So you don't want to take away the tipping model. I know there's been a lot of talk around that. Certain states are saying, well, we just want everybody to get a fair wage and tipping isn't part of that. I mean, you're really going to miss out on that because that's what drives your key service. But I do think there's got to be some careful thought around how do you retain good people to capture that late night market when, you're relying on tips. There might have to be kind of a switch in pay schedules. You might have to pay your third shift not on tips just to get people motivated to stay and have enough incentive. And then you also have, like I said, some of the cities haven't fully returned. So you definitely have some health and safety issues. And I know Starbucks and some of those people have come out, trying to protect their employees from having late night problems because they're open at those times.
Mm-hmm. Now, turning to businesses that are actually in distress and facing a workout or restructuring. Dan, I want to ask you this because I don't want to put Bryn on the spot specifically, but how are lenders responding to distressed borrowers currently? Have they accepted any new normal, or are they making changes to the way in which they deal with them? How should a distressed franchise really interact with their lender in this current environment?
Well, there's no general rule. It's really dependent on the lender and dependent on perhaps the person within the lender. I guess in general, lenders, one thing I guess I want to say here is I don't think a lot of lenders fully understand the situation in franchise lending relative to the power of the franchisor. Bryn mentioned automotive is one of the areas that's struggling a little bit right now, heavily driven by this chip thing of, a year ago, chip shortage. But the franchisor has a huge amount of leverage in a workout situation. And that's because of two primary factors. One's a personal factor, which means that the owner operator almost certainly has guaranteed the franchise agreements across the system. So that's a multi-million-dollar millstone around their neck that has a significant impact on behavior. And the second thing is that to transfer those franchise agreements, you pretty much need the consent of the franchisor because the franchise agreement contains a brand, and that brand is intellectual property. And essentially, even in bankruptcy, the situation is that you can't transfer IP rights without the counterparty agreeing to it. So what that means is that lenders need to be actively involved in somehow with the franchisor, whether that's an agreement with the debtor that they can talk to the franchisor, whether it's a three-way conversation, because the elephant in the room is usually not the lender in these situations, oddly enough. It's the franchisor. And the farther you get in distress, meaning if you get in bankruptcy, for example, they got huge amount of leverage. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that lenders need to force action. I mean, that's no different in any workout situation, is that people generally are slow to do what they need to do to improve the business, save the business, improve the value of the business, all these things. It's just human nature. People don't want to lay people off. They don't want to shut stuff down. They don't want to increase prices. These are all stuff that, hard, tough owners start shaking about, literally, because it scares them, right? So the faster the lender can get in and force something to happen, I don't mean force like demand, but you just push them. You have ways of exercising influence that aren't control, but make it painful for the borrower not to comply. But to me, that's the situation. Franchisors have a huge amount of control, and lenders have to induce. Nobody likes to use the word control. That's a scary word for a lender, but induce people to take action, which is frankly in their best interest. I don't know, Bryn, what do you think?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I get a lot of teasing from my colleagues who are not in workout because I have a playbook. And, one of my playbooks is I engage a consulting firm. One, because it's very difficult, to what Dan said. I mean, I've been doing workouts for over 37 years. There's a lot of emotion here. This is somebody's business. They've built they put all their money in it. Chances are their house is up. They've personally guaranteed the franchisor. They guarantee the bank. They've worked their whole lives in this industry. A lot of these factors that are happening, they have no control over. So, they don't, they didn't cause, interest rates to go up and loan prices to get higher. So what we try and do is bring in an independent third party who can take some of that emotion out. And we use a 13-week cash flow, and we kind of strip out all the noise and say, here's what your cash in is, here's what your cash out is. And let's start talking about how we either make one go up or the other go down. And we do it on a numbers basis for a reason, because chances are the owners of these companies know their employees. They know that, some of this pain, they know so-and-so has 2 kids and is a single mom. They don't want to let that person go, but you have to kind of take that emotion out of it. And so we do that by bringing in somebody that's independent, that doesn't have an ownership interest, to kind of advise them of, let's do it by the numbers. We need to cut X% of our labor. And this is, and it's hard to make those decisions because those are real people. Some of the other decisions, when you get into franchise, somebody has to talk to the franchisor, and the franchisor is going to want to see what are the issues. So, you need a store by store analysis to say, this one's contributing, this one isn't contributing. And that helps the franchisor because they're vested in the success too. Obviously, they don't want stores to fail. That's, a lower footprint for them and impacts their brand. So I think the franchisors are motivated to work with you, but within reason. Every time we go into one of these deals, I use the phrase, it's only a good deal if all 3 of us are unhappy. And that means ownership is unhappy, your franchisor is unhappy, and the bank is unhappy. But, this problem needs to be solved. You're not going to, liquidating this leads to everybody losing. So we all kind of need to move forward on that. And so by bringing in a third party, taking the emotion out of it, looking hard at the numbers, it's much easier than to drive decisions. And then you can bring in some of the softer issues like, okay, this is a great location. We expect it to rebound. And this is what's influencing why that store is weak. And once you get all the numbers, then you can drill down, I think, further. And once you take that emotion out, it makes it easier for the borrower to kind of start to see a path to recovery.
I know the purpose of the webinar is not to, sell MorrisAnderson services, but the thing that people like us, at least good consultants, bring is that the debtor really needs to argue with everyone in this situation, and including the lender that might have referred you in there, because the solution is never a selfish solution for one of those 3 parties. As Bryn said, it's a collaborative solution where everyone loses a little bit, but over a period of time, they start to gain back faster. You gain more yards quicker. And so it's really, really hard for the owner operator, the CEO, to want to argue with his lender about, I don't know, fees, how much principal deferment. I mean, they probably going to live with them for a while. And the franchisor, for sure, they're going to live with them for a while. So to some degree, we become the straight talk, no nonsense hard ass. And the owners, either you can't do that because of their prior relationship or scared to do that. And to us, it's just the obvious things to talk about. And most people refer us, they realize that if I think they're wrong, I'm going to tell them they're wrong. I'm not a shill for anyone. And lenders don't like that, then I don't care. I'll get work from someone else. That's my attitude.
Yeah.
And,
we
Bryn,
bring that level of realism.
I would imagine, Bryn, that sometimes borrowers are reluctant or hesitant or probably angry about the idea of bringing in a consultant, especially if you're talking about a financially distressed business and you're telling them they need to bring on a new professional that's going to cost a lot of money in order to, help with the process. How do you deal with borrowers in that situation? And Dan, how do you deal with, a business that didn't really want you in there in the first place?
Well, I always explain it to people of the reason I'm bringing in a third party is because I speak bank and you speak company operations. And while some of our words are going to be similar, it's like 2 people who are speaking different languages. If you're Italian, if somebody who speaks Italian is talking to somebody who speaks Spanish, certain words are going to be very similar. So you can infer, oh, that's the word for door. He must be talking about open the door or something. It's the same thing in business. I'm focused on certain aspects of what's going on in your financials, but you're focused on the metrics that go behind that. And so I say, the third party like Dan comes in and he's the translator. He's going to give us a path. It's basically a math path that shows, if you do X amount of this, you're going to have X amount of revenue. And based on what it costs you, this is the cost of the revenue. And so here's where there's rooms. Here's where there's pockets to improve. And then the borrower can have the conversation about why certain things are critical to their business. Just like with the franchisor, obviously, one of the key things from a bank's perspective that you have the leverage on a franchisor is their brand. They don't want their brand dragged into bankruptcy if they can avoid it. And as a bank, I don't want them dragged into bankruptcy because all of those fees and expenses are money that could be going to reduce debt and help do the turnaround. So if you can, get somebody who makes each party understand you have something to lose here. So let's try and get to something that's a win-win. And a win-win is not everybody gets what they want. A win-win means each person at the table walks away unhappy. And if everybody's unhappy, you've probably gotten to a decent solution.
Yeah, if I could jump in and tag on to that, couple observations about introducing consultants. One, the soft approach almost never works, meaning that you should. The would approach means it's baked into a forbearance or a waiver or some sort of agreement, works because it's a requirement. Recognize that the majority of people we're dealing with, not all, but like 90% at this point in history, are middle-aged and older men. And people joke that, oh, men don't ask for directions. That's not a joke. That's a reality. That is truly a reality. A man would prefer to be lost, 95, 98% of us, than get directions. A man would prefer to have a heart attack than see a cardiologist. I'm not kidding. These are absolutely serious facts. So to think that a man is going to suffer the ego blow of bringing somebody in and pay him a lot of money to help him, it's happened twice in my life. I've been doing this 30 years, maybe no, 3 times. I'm sorry, 3 times in my life out of probably pitching, I don't know, 400, 500, 600 digs. It hardly ever happens. So you have to force consultants on people. It's tough love. And then our job is to convince the client that, my God, I thought you would be worthless, but you're actually helpful. Oddly enough, in most of these cases, I'd love to tell you that's hard to do, but it ain't, because usually their finance shops are pretty weak. Usually they have no clue how to deal with the franchisor and the lender. They don't understand how to handle vendors. They don't understand how to analyze their business. So the level of analytics we provide is not huge, but it's the obvious stuff to do that they haven't done yet. So, and occasionally you run into a situation when the finance shop is great. I've got one right now, good size consumer products company, does about $750 million a year. Finance shop is super, excellent, top notch. That's really, really rare. So.
Yeah, I would imagine if you're in distress, there's a reason you got in distress, and hopefully it's just the environment, so you could have a good franchise, a good finance shop and get there. But I mean, most of the time,
but it's not just about, Michael. It's not just about getting into stress; it's how you react to it, right?
Yeah.
So if you got a good finance shop, and it's not just a matter of the analytics, but it's also a matter of the personal power of the senior people in the finance shop, and whether or not they really have influence on the business. They can influence their peers and the CEO and the board to take action. So it's not just a matter of doing the analytics, it's what you do with them. And so, it's funny, we help people hire CFOs all the time, and you want accounting skills and public reporting skills. And my response to that is bullshit. I want somebody with courage. I want somebody that'll stand up and say, this is wrong. If they got mediocre financial skills and courage, I'll take that person every day over the best accountant in the world who's a Casper milquetoast dude. That's my
Yeah, I can't tell you how many workouts I've had where the CFO is never surprised to meet me, and the CEO is shocked and appalled that the bank would bring somebody like me to a meeting. And when I ask the CFO for what their cash projection is, they show me, and I look at the CEO and I say, okay, well, this shows you're out of cash in 30 days. What's your plan? And they're stunned. And it's not because the CFO hasn't been saying, it's just that voice that Dan's saying of, hey, if you don't stop doing this, we're going to run out of money. And then obviously, your bank comes in and says, we only have 30 days left. I mean, that's not much of a runway to try and figure out how to stop you from running out of money. And, obviously things have been really great in the economy. So there's been a lot of money in the system, a lot of borrowings, easy to get bank loans, that's tightening now. So a lot of people just assume when they get into trouble, well, I'll just go to the bank and borrow some more money. Most of the time when a bank, gets involved and sees that there's stress, we're not inclined to lend more money. So most of the time I'm saying to the borrower, we're going to do a turnaround and there's not going to be new money lent. And they're always stunned by how precious that cash is and how important it is to conserve. But the CFO has been waving the red flags. They just don't have that voice. So I agree with Dan. You want a CFO with a strong voice that's not afraid to say, look, I can show you mathematically we're headed for a big problem.
So it sounds like the universal perennial problem of being strong enough to hire people that will tell you things you don't want to hear.
Exactly.
It's exactly right. It's exactly. Michael, let me tell you about an odd situation I've got going on right now with a good sized client that kind of hits on this point. We're kind of in the world right now where people talk about adjusted EBITDA, right? That's those 5 pages in the loan document that says that, if the following 82 events happen, it doesn't really count, right? And so I'm very
it's non-recurring.
Yeah, exactly. Salaries are non-recurring. Apparently next year everyone's working for free. My current client has a huge amount of non-recurring. Last year they had, I don't know, $40 million of non-recurring or $50 million. A good portion of those really are one-time events. But the whole company talks about adjusted EBITDA, ignoring the fact that most of those non-recurring adjustments from EBITDA cost cash. And so as long as their adjusted EBITDA is up, they're doing fine, despite the fact they're bleeding. And it's been a real challenge with myself and the finance team is going, this is wrong. And real challenge with myself and the finance team to try to explain to them, it's really about your cash position, not your adjusted EBITDA or even the EBITDA position. And it's coming around, but it was kind of dangerous because they've deluded themselves into believing that this PE constructed metric of adjusted EBITDA somehow really impacts their viability going forward. And it doesn't. So it's been interesting.
I had a client recently that was basically dealing with everything in an accrual basis. And was losing track of their cash position because they were doing everything in an accrual basis. When you move into a distressed situation, everything is cash.
Exactly. Yeah, you can make a lot of money and run out of cash and still die.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you have enough non-recurring problems. I mean, yes, you might have any one problem, but you're going to have a non-recurring event at a certain level every year. It's going to be something different every year.
Right. I mean, even just as a consumer, I always try and remind my kids, you want things for a rainy day. You want, your car's 4 years old, at a certain point it needs repairs. Those repairs never come right when you get your paycheck and you happen to have an extra couple $100. It's always going to come when you're leveraged to the max and you have $5 in your checking account and you're going to put it on your 32% credit card now to have to pay for it. I mean, it's the same thing with businesses. They, and they've gotten, economically too, we've had just such a long run of credit being so loose. And so they've taken on more leverage and more leverage and more leverage. And then the second there's a problem and you flip to cash, they're always stunned because they're like, well, but look at I've always been in compliance with my covenants. I'm like, well, that's because of all the one-time add backs you've had, but those aren't really cash.
Yeah. Well, now I'd like to move to kind of talking about franchisors and dealing with franchisors. I know that banks are very familiar with the workout process. They have their own departments that deal with special asset situations, as Bryn can attest. How are franchisors dealing with workouts? Do they have dedicated staff? Are they familiar with it? Or is it basically, do you have to teach them how they should be dealing with the situation? Dan, why don't I start with you on this one?
Well, franchisors go through cycles, right? So, Burger King, just to pick a name.
Random?
Yeah, well, I'm in a Burger King gate case, so it's pretty easy to, actually in 2 Burger King cases, so it's pretty easy to talk about Burger King, although, anyway, Burger King's on the front end of a number of problems, and there are other franchisors that are on the number of problems. So what happens in those situations, because it becomes we have problems for 2 or 3 years, then we don't have problems for 10 years type of thing, is they have to kind of gear up for the whole process. And being on the front end, and I've been several deals where the franchisor does have either a dedicated person or somebody who's in charge. So it's not kind of like a workout person for them or a special assets person. So it's not like they're totally naive, but much like a lender that's worried about a relationship, let's say with a private equity firm that might have 5 or 6 deals and you have one deal, there's an issue of precedent and an issue of how that impacts the rest of them. Or if a franchise or if a lender has maybe 6 deals with one brand, the first one's kind of important. So how do they react? They're very, very worried about precedent on the front end of the cycle. Very worried, because whatever is not public knowledge of how they dealt with the first and the second one, it's going to be pretty hard not to do at least that, if not more, on the next one. So the first thing you need to learn about franchisors is that they're taxing machines. And what that means is they tax people that use their brands in 2 ways. They tax them with royalties to use the brand, and then they tax them for advertising and marketing money because they market their brand. So that tax is a function of revenue. And so that means if you shut restaurants down, revenue declines and their tax goes down. So the natural motivation for franchisors is they don't want you to shut anything, and they really don't care that you're losing money. That's probably a little too harsh, but they don't care that much. So they will resist shutting restaurants to the bitter end. So let me tell you the tale of 2 cities that I've had active both right now. In one situation, they're both about the same size. They're both 120 some store, restaurant, QSRs, different brands. In one situation, we had a lot of money, and another situation, we were close to we were less than 1 week of cash, and we were bleeding pretty badly. Let me tell you, the situation that was better was the one we were short of cash and bleeding pretty badly, because as I met with the brand, I said, "Here's the deal: either we're going to run out of cash or we're going to shut stores. I choose to shut stores. We're shutting stores tomorrow. You can't do that. That's against the franchise agreement. We're going to sue everyone." I said, "I'd rather have that happen than missing payroll. We're shutting stores." So that was advantageous, oddly enough. And that group of stores now are doing quite well financially. The other case, you had a lot of money. The client wanted to give the franchisor every chance to agree to shut stores, and 5 months later and $3 or $4 million later, now we're getting to the point where we're getting close on cash and we're going to shut stores. I would contend it was an advantage to be out of cash, oddly enough, which you shouldn't think, because Bryn and I deal in the world of being the real variable we have in workouts is time, and time is usually defined by how much cash you have. Because the more time you have and the more cash you have, the more options you have. But in these situations where the franchisor is not going to want you to shut down restaurants, and what they hang over your head is enforcement of the personal guarantees. And then also they usually have cross default provisions within their franchise agreements, which means if one goes in default, they can default them all. It's unusual for them to exercise that right, because that almost forces you to file bankruptcy, right, to avoid the termination of franchise agreements. But I've seen it happen. So, but that's the franchisor gig. The franchisor gig is don't shut down restaurants, delay, defer as long as possible. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, you just have to understand that's what you're going to face. The other problem the franchisor has is you think about royalties as a recurring revenue stream. Most franchisors have that securitized in a bond. And those bonds have covenants relative to how many stores, what your minimum royalties are per month, that sort of stuff. So they probably can let you shut your stores. The problem is, how do they deal with the next 5 guys that have to shut stores too? So that's the dynamic that goes on. In my view, you pretty much have to go in with we're going to do it. We don't give a shit what the ramifications are. If we don't do that, we don't have a viable entity. That's where you usually end up in those situations.
Yeah, I totally agree with Dan. It's almost like you're dealing with two different banks your bank that you borrowed money from, and then your franchisor who you pay taxes and, allows you the use of their name and their product. So, like Dan said, it's all about setting precedent. So you can, come up with, for example, CapEx is huge. As Dan said, for 3 years, there's been no money to do any CapEx on the store. So there's a lot of deferred maintenance. And obviously, it's a big branding issue for the franchisor. They want their stores to look a certain way, and everybody should come into a franchise and have the same feel to them. And so for us as lenders, we're like not only cognizant of the fact that they have this drain on cash flow from the stores that aren't performing, but you also have the looming big cash outlay that's going to happen because nobody's been forced to do the CapEx for the last 3 years. But, are the franchisors going to suddenly come in and say, okay, you've done none, so here's the bill. You need to spend $2 million to make up for the last 3 years because you're behind on our schedule. So as Dan said, they have the power to renegotiate those terms, but it takes time. And obviously, the shorter cash runway you have, the less options you have to be able to negotiate with them. In some cases, if we get in there and the cash runway is only 2 or 3 weeks, you're going into a bankruptcy because there's no other option where we can bring everybody to the table and get these decisions made quickly. So the longer runway you have, the better chance you have. But don't forget, you've got to negotiate with the franchisor, but there's another, big gorilla sitting on everybody's shoulders, and that's the landlords. So, and these landlords, it's not one landlord for 20 stores. It's one landlord for each of the 100 stores. So you have 100 landlords that you're going to have to negotiate with. Obviously, you can tier them into the stores that are the weakest performing to the stores that are the best. But you have the franchisor who's going to, want to see store by store analysis, wants to weigh in. And I will tell you, they have come to the table in most of the cases we've dealt with. It's a painful process for them, just like it's a painful process for everyone at the table. But they can make concessions, but they're kind of reluctant. Do I give you a period with no franchise fees? What do I do when the 10 other franchisees come to me and want the same deal? So, it's a lot. One of the franchise deals that I got in recently, the owner called somebody senior at the bank and was like, I don't know who this Bryn is, but it's almost like she's calling me dishonest. Everything I tell her that's going on, she wants to see in a cash flow or wants MorrisAnderson to come in and look at. And, I had a very frank conversation with the guy, like, I'm not calling you dishonest, but where we're going is your landlords are going to see these cash flows, your franchisor are going to see the cash flows, the bank's going to see the cash flow. It's all about transparency. If everybody's going to be giving something, they want to know what the other person's giving up too. So as a bank, I don't want to go into a workout deal if the landlords are getting 100% of their dollars and I'm not. And the same thing with the franchisor. They don't want to make concessions if the bank's not going to make concessions. And if capital isn't going to come in. So it's a very, very slow process. And there's been a couple of cases where I've really wondered, are we just going to have to go into bankruptcy to force everybody to come to the table? I mean, that's a shame because you're talking millions of dollars in fees. But sometimes you just, with 100 different landlords, sometimes it's just not possible to bring them to the table. But in that case, we do also have consultants that will come in and take that whole thing off the owner's plate. Because remember, the owner's also running the company. So the owner has to report to the bank. They have to report to the franchisor. They're trying to negotiate with 100 landlords. People just don't have that capability. And so that's why in my profession, we get a bad rap because they're like, oh, it's workout. You're going to force me to hire a bunch of people I can't afford. But the bottom line is those are very specialized hires. You're hiring Dan to come in and look at your cash flow and help you, create a plan. So he's going to make the cash available and he's going to more than pay for himself in the advice that he's giving you. On the landlord side, you have people that will come in and help you renegotiate your leases, but they need the tool. So Dan needs to help them create the tool that says, hey, you're the landlord. Here's where my traffic has gone. So, don't look at my sales because my sales look higher because I've raised prices. Look at what I'm making. I'm losing money every day that I'm open in your location. So your store is on the chopping block. Now, if you could lower the lease payments short term, we think this and this could happen and maybe we can turn it around. But that's 100 conversations they have to have. And they just don't have the staffing for that either. So.
It reminds me of a lesson, one thing you said there about kind of the changing incentives and changing way to look at things and how everything has really changed for the borrower. It reminds me of a lesson that I remember in my first day of my bankruptcy class in law school, which is our law professor told us that, a good lawyer's intuition will get them to the right result 90% of the time, except in bankruptcy, where they get them to the exact wrong result.
Right.
Because the incentives have flipped so much in a workout situation. It is so, you've gone through the looking glass as it is. And you really need someone in there who speaks the language and knows what they're talking about. I'm glad you mentioned landlords, because that's exactly where I wanted to go next. How how do they factor into the workout situation? I know that they are a huge function. They are the kind of the third the third major counterparty that borrowers have to deal with.
Yeah, it's very difficult because you have different levels. You have different landlords for each property, and you have different levels of sophistication. So, in the old days, you could just say, well, if we don't get these concessions, we're filing bankruptcy. Your unsophisticated parties are like, well, I don't care. Maybe I want in bankruptcy because I don't know how to read your financial statement. I don't know if I'm getting a fair deal. So it's a very time consuming process. And that, coupled by the fact that obviously the real estate market itself has a lot of challenges. So, I mean, for, people always talk about, the butterfly effect. I mean, if the store goes dark, I hate to say it, but it could be my bank that's holding the real estate loan on that store. So you get double impacted. So a lot of people are affected by this. And it takes a lot of work to go creditor by creditor and figure out what you're going to do. But the landlords are going to be probably your first or your second largest pool of creditors. So they need a seat at the table. You need to have discussions with them. And, they need to get that transparency, which I think so many borrowers are reluctant to share. They're like, well, I don't want to make all this information public. And I totally understand that. But at the same time, it's very difficult for the landlord to understand, if they look at just your total financials, they don't necessarily understand their store's impact on your total financials. So it's a delicate process to bring everybody in.
Mm-hmm.
Dan, you've obviously dealt with quite a bit of landlord problems.
So, Bryn, you talked about most of the factors involved. I always start out with what stores are losing money, right? And there's certain stores that are at a point that you'll never fix them. The numbers are so negative that even if you could fix them, somebody's got to pay for those losses for an extended period of time. So they're dead. Then you got a group of stores that are marginal, that if you could extract some concessions from either the landlord or maybe from the franchisor, it's probably worth keeping them open to find out whether or not you can flip them. And then obviously you got stores that you're making money at, some a little and some a lot. And by the way, the ones that you make a little at are a little problematic too, because if you've got a store that, let's say, is making, I don't know, $100,000 a year at a restaurant level, but you're supposed to put in, $500,000 of CapEx to that store, that's pretty hard unless you're going to get a large sales increase post remodeling. It's pretty hard to justify that expenditure. It doesn't pay for itself, right? So, but going back to landlords, you described it right. You've got different kinds of landlords. You've got REITs that are very sophisticated that might own a number of stores. You got investor groups that might own a smaller number of stores. And then you got individual investors that either might be savvy people or just ma and pa's that may not be savvy people. Relative, I don't mean smart, but just understand the economics of how a restaurant operates and what they can afford to pay. The general rule in QSR and casual is if you're paying anything more than 8% of AUV, annual unit volume, you should look at it. You're over 10% is clearly too much. So we segment stores like that. So there's two things you can do with the stores. One, you can shut them down, and then you got the lease termination issue, right? And then secondarily, you could try to negotiate concessions. When you're trying to shut them down, if you're shutting down a relatively small number of stores, you can probably negotiate yourself out of almost all of them, 80, 90%. I know we had an Applebee's deal a couple of years ago where I think we shut down 20 stores. We negotiated out of every single one of the leases. The average cost was like 6 months, 7 months. It wasn't horrible. We had enough cash to do it. I think we paid one or two guys like a year, but most people, we didn't pay a huge amount of money. But I've got another deal. We need to shut down 50 stores. I've told my client, I can't imagine we can negotiate with that many people, even using an outside party and getting it done. Not to mention that if you're looking at, let's say shutting down 50 stores and you got to pay everyone the rents, let's say $10K a month, which is about normal, 60 months at $60K times a store times 50 stores, that's over $3 million. That actually makes bankruptcy start to look attractive, right? Because, you want to spend the money in lease deal, you want to spend it on lawyers and consultants in bankruptcy. But at least there you can leave everything behind. So it's a classic case where bankruptcy works pretty well. But I think in the lease negotiations, you really need somebody who knows how to do that. We usually bring in a real estate firm to help us do that. Bankruptcy actually really helps those negotiations. Shutting down stores helps those negotiations because that makes it more real for the counterparty that, oh shit, this isn't a bluff. they're really doing stuff, and I could be one of those stuffs. So, but it used to be, if you go back in the restaurant industry many years ago, most people owned their real estate. And so you occasionally see a situation where an owner operator has, maybe in a different legal entity, but he or she owns their real estate. Those are usually people that have been in that business for 20.
Dan, I think you froze again. Oh, well, I think hopefully he'll come back in a second.
He'll come back in for sure. Yeah.
Well, we are, while we have this little break, we're waiting for Dan to come back in. Kristen, you want to pull the, we're nearing the end. You want to pull the winner of the Corner Bakery gift certificate?
Oh yeah.
Sure thing. Let me take a look real quick.
We need a drum roll.
So it looks like we are going to go with Julie Silverman is the winner.
All right.
Fantastic. Congratulations.
I'll go to lunch with you if you want, Julie.
Well, Bryn, do you have any, we're nearing the end. Do you have any advice you'd want to leave with, franchise business owners that are in distress that you think would be helpful for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the concept of this transparency is so important. I always try and counsel the borrowers, I'm not questioning that you're being dishonest with me, but the verification process, the transparency process is something that you're going to have to get used to with all of your creditors. I mean, it's the most difficult thing you'll go through as an entrepreneur, but if you have to go into bankruptcy, the stuff that I'm asking for and the stuff that I'm validating, like it or not, a lot of people rely on the banks to do this due diligence because the banks, as the secured creditor, have the most to win or lose. So really getting that transparency from the borrower for all creditors is kind of a map that we're very dedicated to starting with. And that's the same format then that's the playbook that everybody's working off of. So your capital structure is going to see that, your lenders are going to see that, your largest creditors are going to see that. So in this case, the franchisor's got to see it. They've got to see it store by store. And then they want to obviously see, well, what is the bank giving up and how does that improve the situation? And the bank wants to see, what is the franchisor doing to help? Are they deferring CapEx? So my future cash flow is not going to be a problem for me. And then the question, the capital structure wants to see, somebody's probably going to have to put in more money. That's always, part of the three-pronged plan. How does the capital come in? And how does everybody ultimately end up getting repaid if we get things back on track? And then obviously your landlords in this case have a big thing. So the transparency in a franchisee deal is so critical because you do have so many pools of creditors. And the only way that we can all communicate is, again, that language consultant, which is your 13-week cash flow. Here's where cash is. You can see that the pool of cash is X. We can all go to court and fight over who gets what percentage of the pool. A, you're going to pay a fortune to your lawyers to win your percent. And B, you're not going to get 100% of what you think. So isn't it better to conserve all the cash and all of us come up with concessions to A, help the pool and get the company through the problem, and then B, we're each going to take a smaller piece of the pie, but the piece of the pie you're taking is still bigger than it would be in a legal proceeding most of the time. as Dan said, sometimes if you have so many creditors, you need a venue to bring them into. And that's a delicate balance as well. But if you can avoid the venue and everybody can row in the same direction, you can oftentimes, get something that lasts and comes out of bankruptcy and a restructure and returns to all your creditors more than what they would have gotten.
That's great. Dan, welcome back. Sorry we lost you there for a minute. We are just, do you have any we're near the end. Do you have any parting thoughts, advice you'd give to franchise borrowers, franchisees, if they are in distress and facing a workout or restructuring?
I think it's always best to reach out to counsel, and people don't like to use the word bankruptcy counsel because that implies they're going to file bankruptcy. I would tell you probably only 10 to 15% of the times that I'm in cases that I help bring in bankruptcy counsel or they're involved, we file bankruptcy. I think bankruptcy counsel probably more helps you not file bankruptcy than file bankruptcy, but nevertheless, maybe it should be called non-bankruptcy counsel. I think you need professional help. So why do you do that? Well, if you have a heart attack, you don't buy a book and say, well, I suppose I could learn how to be a heart surgeon. I mean, is that really what you do? I don't think so. You find a heart surgeon. And by the way, I always find it humorous when people talk about the prices of all this, So yeah, we've had a heart attack and we've decided to now, run an auction and shop for the lowest price surgeon to help me. Really? Is that really what you do? I guess you kind of get what you pay for when you do that, in my opinion, but some people do that a lot. So anyway, my big advice, Michael, is that you need help in these situations. And I know it's a little bit of a ludicrous proposition that you're cash poor and you're struggling and you're going to bring somebody in and pay them a lot of money. But oddly enough, it does pay for itself 98% of the time. It's hard you'll never convince a borrower of that, though. The only thing you can convince them of is that you have to do it. They grudgingly do it. And then usually they go, yeah, that was actually a pretty good idea. I didn't think it was going to be. It was a pretty good idea. And that's the skill of the consultant, is to actually really add some value and turn their client around, essentially, not just financially, but emotionally, from this is a lender's shill, waste of money deal to, no shit, this really is helpful. And that's usually what happens, not always, but usually what happens. Sometimes you end up fighting with your clients and it doesn't work out. There are people that really do know everything about everything. I've met several of them. I probably used to be that way when I was a teenager, but unfortunately, every day that goes on, I learn I don't know very much, and I pick up a few more things. So anyway, humility comes with age, I think.
I think it's interesting. Yes, you are bearing the cost of the consultant, but the whole point of them is to make sure that the losses are being shared, frankly, among the different constituency groups. So you're not really bearing the cost of that consultant at the end of the day. And if they work things out in such a manner that they will more than pay for themselves, as you said. We are out of time. I really appreciate both you joining us. Bryn, Dan, thank you very much. Maybe we can have another one of these conversations again in the future, another year when the economy is completely different and we're dealing with different industries and different problems. But thank you both for joining us today, and we look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks so much for hosting and inviting us. We both really enjoyed it.
You did.